Welcome back to Good News, Bad News, the Libertarian Christian Roundtable, where we are proud to say this week that Ron Paul was right, and if of all of his predictions. And so we're very proud to be Ron Paul supporters, fans,
Even now,
influenced, whatever,
2021.
even in 2021. The man
Should I
ain't
be holding
perfect,
this?
but my
Like-
gosh, was he right about the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, or
Okay.
any war for that matter, or any financial,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Doug.
calamity that's about to happen. We'll probably be back on this next week
Yeah.
to say he was right about something else. But this week, the top story, of course, is the colossal issues going on in Afghanistan. So, Norman, I'm going to have you kind of lead off with the overview and somewhat of an analysis.
Yeah, so this is an absolutely insane development, but it is also not really unexpected. The story really begins, of course, 20 years ago when we first go into a country where we are purportedly just going to be, hunting down terrorism, and then it turns into nation building and an unending war, and it becomes literally the longest war in American history. Of course, even just a year ago, while President Trump was still in office, and I don't remember the exact dating of it all, but there was a plan put in place that by May of 2021, that the U.S. forces would ultimately begin a pullout of Afghanistan, and eventually meaning no more U.S. forces in the country. And this had to do with a treaty, essentially. I think it could be properly called a treaty, or some type of agreement that happened between the Afghan government and the Taliban, in fact. But as circumstances would have it, the development is that, well, the Taliban started kind of going on the offensive and started taking over more counties, to the point at which over the last week, this is, as far as, from what I can see in the maps, it looks like their control is well over 50% of the landmass of Afghanistan. And at this point, even the country's leaders have basically fled the country. There's a lot of turmoil. And of course, the U.S. is now undergoing essentially an evacuation of all personnel and American citizens in the country. This has, of course, just resulted in, ever more kind of turmoil overall. And it's really awful. And I don't want to make light of the situation whatsoever, just to say, Ron Paul was right. But yeah. Ron Paul was right in that, in fact, almost 10 years ago exactly, he said, look, if we're going to be at the rate we are on right now, we are going to be here another 10 years. He was right about that. He was also right 13 years ago when he said that we should pull out when he was in Republican presidential debates, and people laughed at it. And what's really particularly interesting today is that when President Joe Biden delivered a press conference in the White House this afternoon to talk about the situation, Biden was even saying some things that, I kid you not, almost sound like possible things that Ron Paul could have said had he been in charge of the
Maybe he sent him a memo.
Who knows? It would.
My optimist
saying to the point how, Biden basically said on effectively national television in a press conference, how many more of your sons and daughters should I send into Afghanistan to fight their own civil war? Who says that other than Ron Paul? I haven't heard any. Actually, we should say Trump kind of alluded to the same thing. So, remarkable that is, that's actually happening now. But accordingly, you would the stuff that you would expect to hear from the media is, it's a disaster. Like on the conservative side, there are people criticizing Biden because we should have doubled down. We should be back in there. We should be war hawking the whole thing.
Well, they're interesting, though. I will say there was an Afghan veteran and former CIA analyst. His name's Matt Zeller, who actually said they had plans during the Trump administration for evacuation and moving people out and giving, letting the leaders actually take control over Taliban. Although we've been hearing that the military has been lying about the whole situation there. But that in the last hour, those plans weren't utilized, and now we've got people clinging to to airplanes and falling out of them to try and escape the country, which is terrible. By the way,
Yeah.
I'm just here because most of these guys, you know, they do look like they want to murder you, but they're doing it in a nice way.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm just trying to blend in. That's all.
It's amazing, even the types of stuff we're hearing from the media in this regard, even to that extent. And it's very strange, but it's also just very sad because very clearly it's not like the Taliban are good guys. We know this, but there's no way. I mean, if anything, if we've learned anything in the past 50 years of trying to intervene in the Middle East, multiple countries, not just the U.S., is that you can't do it. You're gonna lose. And I mean, even a month ago, Biden was saying like, "Oh, the Taliban can't pull anything off anyway. They don't have an air force. They don't have the capability. Right. They can't do this sort of thing." Well, you know what? They proved you wrong. And like that's consistent with the not even just last 50 years of American interventionism in the Middle East. It's 100 years of interventionism from various countries. I mean,
back in April, he said they're not going to take over.
And it's just infuriating because like the more the more that we have remained there, the less that people become capable of just even the less that people are able to solve their own problems, and it's just resulting in boondoggle after boondoggle. It's ridiculous and it's sad. It is awful to see that this is going to be that this is going to be a regression for the country anyway. But it was inevitable. And Biden said in the press conference today that if we had done this 5 years ago or 15 years from now, it probably looked like the same thing. And you know what? He's not wrong. That's more like a Ron Paul type of thing to say.
I would say there's probably some way to avoid people, being slaughtered in the streets, but it is bad money. It is bad money chasing after other bad money. And I there's probably a better way to do it, although it is a bad situation overall.
That's like ex post facto analysis, though. Like, of course, any number of things you could have done better in the post analysis, but you can't predict the future. And it's like these things we know from history that the one thing we know from interventions in the Middle East is that they don't go as planned.
Well, the Russians weren't able to do it. We weren't able to do it. The Brits weren't able to do it. So what did we expect?
To be fair, Ron Paul's advice was you just leave.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what was said. In the debates, he was asked about that. Well, how do you leave? And he says,
we just walked in, we can just walk out.
Exactly. And it's not, nobody's saying it's going to be pretty and that, there's going to be this wonderful thing that is left over when we walk out. But the point is we shouldn't have walked in to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an insult.
I thought Afghanistan was a state by now. I'm actually kind of surprised by this thing.
Well, I mean, all of this, the past 20 years have just been an insult to the American people and the Afghani people.
Mm-hmm.
And it has resulted in nothing but, historic suffering, and will continue to suffer. Like the best thing we could have done for them would have been to pull out 15 years ago or 13 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Like the sooner the better it would have been.
It had a destabilizing effect that has just caused ripples, and at some point you're saying the Band-Aid needed to be ripped off, and it's unfortunate that they've made their own bed at this point.
Yeah,
choose your analogy.
You're using two metaphors here that I don't think. I mean, like metaphors are inherently,
flawed to begin with.
To begin with. Yeah. But it's like this isn't pulling a Band-Aid off. We weren't bandaging it. It was. I mean, it's a boondoggle from any way you look at it. You can't manage this situation, and we know that central planning doesn't work for our own economy. Yeah. We know that central planning doesn't work even at a city level. How is it going to work when Washington is trying to manage an entire other people with an entire different culture, with a military that is fighting against an entrenched interest that has been there for 100 years and hasn't budged?
Yeah.
Good luck with that. It's not even good luck. It's like it's insanity, and it should have ended long ago. As you can tell, this makes me a little frustrated. You can find and you can find, of course, many other people of similar ilk and disposition raining hell on these of rhetoric on this sort of material, because it's just it's infuriating to see, and
Yeah,
It is what it is, guys. God bless the Afghani people because they need it.
I just want to add here as a sort of transition point that on libertarianchristians.com there are a lot of articles, anti-war articles, articles dealing with foreign policy, what does peace look like, how do we make the way for peace, and then of course, things like we've been saying tonight.
And the history of conflict in the Middle East.
Yes, the history of conflict in the Middle East. Yeah, Norman just took the words right out of my mouth. And so, but there's someone who I can't put words in their mouth because I'm not a female, and Carrie is going to, lead us in.
It's a running joke, guys.
Yes,
it is.
If you go back and watch our videos down the playlist, and you'll get the joke. So Carrie has got some feminist take on Afghanistan. What are the feminists saying, Carrie?
Oh my word! Oh my word! You know me better, Doug.
No, I don't mean that. I mean you've got it as the thing you're talking about. I wasn't saying you have the take.
Well.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Over to our resident woman. What do women think about this, Carrie?
Okay, so the reason why I want to bring this up is because and Norman, you mentioned Warhawks and how they're doubling down and saying we should have stayed. But it's interesting because I think the new sort of brand of Warhawks are feminists. There's been several articles, and one article in particular that I pulled up for this specifically from The Guardian. The title reads, "An Afghan woman," who's the author of the article, "in Kabul. Now I have to burn everything I achieved. A university student tells of seeing seeing all around her the fearful faces of women and ugly faces of men who hate women." So, and it's I'm not going to highlight any more of the article because it's a very emotional sort of thing. And I don't want to downplay the fact that the Taliban does not have a high view of women at all. In fact, one of the first things that they did when they got back into power is they ordered women back into their into their hijabs and burqas and things. And so, but it's interesting because some of the new Warhawks are these liberal feminists who are saying, no, we need America to stay there in order to protect women, in order to protect young girls and people like that. And I just wanted, this is one of the things that really frustrates me about feminists is that they have not figured out what freedom for women actually means. They think that the state is the guarantor of our rights, and the state doesn't protect women. I don't think that it's fair to say that men are generally our enemy, although the Taliban is
generally our enemy.
There are some specific cases in which they are.
Only men wielded with the state.
Yeah, well, when you get the Taliban, and this is ideology. This is, sorry, Matthew, patriarchy. But women, we have to separate this idea. Women, feminists, anybody who supports women's rights have to separate the idea of civil governance from the state. Women absolutely need civil governance. I imagine that will eventually peter away in Afghanistan, and they'll revert back to some of their terrible practices. But
they have governance, but it surely is not civil.
Yeah. If, one of the things that she says in this article is we've been fighting for our freedom for 20 years. And,
really?
Or whatever it was. Yeah, I think it was, she said 20 years. But I kind of feel like if the Afghan people don't understand who's responsible for their freedom by this point, then they weren't ever fighting for it to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. military didn't actually bring freedom to the Afghan people. They brought U.S. paternalism to supplant Islamic patriarchy. So they didn't actually get freedom over there. They just got a different brand of central planning that didn't interfere with didn't interfere with what women were doing.
Yeah.
From one brand of paternalism to another.
Right. So, this is Women also have the most to lose under authoritarianism, and it's because we are the ones who are capable of childbearing, and that makes us more vulnerable. But authoritarianism in any situation is not good for women. Women have the most to lose from that. But women will also never really be free until we understand who's responsible for our freedom and stop trying to make other people responsible for it, or making the state or somebody else responsible for it on our behalf. But this is also why women need to get consistent on concepts like bodily autonomy and agency. They're of vital importance to women's rights, but we have to be consistent on it. And women aren't. Feminists aren't consistent on this point.
Well, the best way to claim bodily autonomy is get a gun. So,
well, learn some kind of self-defense, for crying out loud. I mean, knife fighting, hand-to-hand combat, like,
but a gun
any of those things
really works.
Well, I don't know. If you watch the Mythbusters episode, it's better to have a knife.
Yeah, but never mind.
Well, I'm not anti-gun.
Well.
Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying there's more options than a gun out there.
You're pro self-defense.
Yes, I'm
pro-choice
absolutely
and a method of self-defense for women.
right. But
Why not have both?
You ask these women about
Knife,
mandatory.
your bayonet.
You ask these women about mandatory COVID measures, and I guarantee you they are absolutely in favor of forcing women to, to comply with those measures. So, they may oppose a head covering, but they're not opposed to a face covering. I'd like to know why. But at any rate, so this is just, I just want to put this out there for any woman who happens to be watching this. Feminists are not consistent on this. The libertarian view, I think, is very, very consistent, but there's no point in saying, well, what we need is the state to protect our rights, because maybe it protected them or gave them some facade of protection for 13, 15, 20 years, whatever.
Temporary security.
Very temporary security, but because they never took ownership of their freedom and themselves and took responsibility for their rights, as soon as that guarantor walked away, they had nothing. They have nothing. So they're at the mercy of the Taliban.
Isn't that the whole premise of Who Moved My Cheese?
What?
Well,
There's a
not
book
everybody
called
listening may know about that book.
I don't know that.
Okay.
much.
I'm
I have
just
the book.
making
I haven't
sure.
read it, but I have it on my shelf.
Anyways,
Well,
By the way, just to bring us all down another level, what? Oh, sorry, if you weren't ready or
no,
done.
be my
Kay,
guest.
Go ahead, and then I'll interrupt you.
Well, actually, can I
well-
interject one other thing here that's related to this to the Afghanistan situation as well? Even
Sure.
10 years ago, I don't remember when exactly it was, but I want to say it was 10 to 12 years ago. There was a report from the U.S. State Department that said there were no longer any churches in Afghanistan. Do you guys remember this? Because this was
Vaguely.
put out.
Yeah.
This was put out,
I'm
it
glad
was,
you're bringing this up, Norman. Yeah.
because this was put out by the U.S. State Department. Okay, this was not some conspiratorial website or somebody who was making just blowing hot air. The U.S. State Department put out that report, and I actually wrote. When I discovered this, I actually wrote an article about it, and it's somewhere on LCI's website from the distant past. And this was actually pre-LCI days when it was just libertarianchristians.com. But I was shocked that was the case. But even so, it's been a long time coming that this was all going to fall apart. It's been falling apart. It's just been a slow fall and descent. And people's we weren't establishing freedom there. And now we're getting these reports about the house churches that have been home churches, admittedly, around for the past decade. There will always be Christians in Afghanistan. They will remain. They're not going anywhere.
That's what I was going to bring up. Is actually we're now getting more and more reports from people speaking up through social media and other places where Christian brothers and sisters who were making very good inroads in a lot of communities and rebuilding communities of faith who are showing that they are having to go into hiding, where the Taliban is openly saying, we know where you are, who you are, and how to find you. There are reports of people having their children ripped from their arms and forced into sexual servitude. 14-year-old daughter ripped from this one pastor's arms and forced into a Taliban marriage. Just heart-wrenching stuff.
Pray for your brothers and sisters in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. So
this is the worst.
Yeah.
But this is going to happen. If it wasn't now, it would be in 15 years. If it wasn't now, it might have been 5 years ago if it had happened earlier. And it sucks.
Yep.
All right. Have a really good segue to the next.
Well, I'll segue it for you, because we were talking about how one type of totalitarian government taking over, and we're seeing more and more situations in our own world in the West where we are seeing a permission society start to grow, where people are having to gain access to certain services or businesses that they once had before, and are now being required to get vaccine. I don't want to use the word passports because that's not the word they're using it, but basically that's what it is, or a negative COVID test. That we're living in more of a world of fear over here with COVID-19. And more areas of our life are being really just kind of taken over by this whole idea that you either have to get the vaccine or else. So we saw a article on Reason about the free society dwindling as a permission requirements grow. And it really is just kind of sad to see where people used to live their lives not but a year ago, and now we're kind of coming to fears, whether they're founded or not. There's just a new wave and a new way to discriminate against one another, and that's really where the sad aspect of this really starts to turn out. And as we were talking before the cameras were turned on, basically we keep seeing the goalposts of what those permissions are and where the standards are. They're not fixed and set. They seem to keep moving every so often. Carrie brought up an article where it actually said that the vaccine, if you are out 3 months from receiving it, is probably no longer viable. So that was coming out of St. Louis. So
St. Louis County.
Yeah, so my neck of the woods.
Yeah. So people are saying, okay, you may have had the vaccine, but how long ago did you have it? So again, this discrimination is just going to continue until I think people are kind of fed up with it and just go on back to living their lives.
And it's just it's so terrible because it's not as if none of us here are anti-vaccine. No. I'm a scientist, for goodness sakes, and I work in infection control right now. And this is.
Wait, is this whole thing your fault, Norman?
Thanks.
If you ask my kids, it's all my fault.
I had to ask. That's all.
Yeah, I developed it in my basement. That's what I did. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important. I think it's important to point out that this false dichotomy between pro-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, or the vaccinated and unvaccinated, is complete nonsense. Because at the end of the day, even if you are on the pro-vax, I'm fully vaccinated side, chances are that in a period of time, seems like much shorter than we would think is normal for a typical booster, you are no longer going to be fully vaccinated, and you're going to have to take this shot again in order to function in society.
And again.
Why?
And it's but the thing is, even if there are plausible reasons why there might be reasons to do that, trying to other each other through this process of permissioning everything is not a way of dealing with this problem.
No,
you can't. Similar to interventions in the Middle East, this is not something we can manage our way out of like this. You can't do it.
You hamstring a society. You stifle an economy. Yeah. It's a terrible mix.
The only way that we can realistically like overcome these things is by acting like adults, talking to each other, letting good people do good work in order to develop good materials that help us to combat things in the right way, and not letting politicians anywhere, whether it's at a county level or a president or a bureaucratic organization, just order us frickin' around.
Right.
That's where this goes wrong. And it's just and that's where, you know, as Carrie's on this false dichotomy, like Carrie and I can disagree about various things, and that's okay because we're adults and we know how to disagree with each other respectfully. Come on, can we do that as a society, please? Or do we want to end up like a new Taliban?
Right. Well, and you know, when you have Fauci up there saying things like the only way that we're going to be able to go back to normal society is through this vaccine. That's the only way. Libertarians are saying, no, there's got to be more than one way.
Yeah.
Right. We're not saying no vaccine.
Yeah.
We're saying, no, we need many more
thousand flowers
alternatives.
bloom.
Right.
You know?
we need many more options out there so that people who don't want the vaccine actually do have a suitable alternative. It's not that we want people sick and dying and we want to go back to medieval medicine and nonsense like that. Like all of those absolutely ridiculous attacks. No, we don't need just one option to return to normal. We need several options, and we can't do that with the government trying to centrally plan this.
And it's a relatively new area of science, and new things are being discovered about it every single day. For someone to authoritatively say this is the only way that we're going to get society back on track is a little short-sighted and frankly smacks of totalitarianism and hubris.
Or at least a lot of hubris.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm appreciative of somebody like I hesitate to bring it up, but like Francis Collins, who's the director of the NIH, has said in an interview with that I saw in Chemical and Engineering News about that one of the things that really needs to be focused on is something that has been very not talked about, is the development of antivirals.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm kind of getting a little off topic here, but like, you want to know why we don't have proper antivirals? Well, just look at the way the FDA has behaved, and and that the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act have basically stifled innovation over the last 30 years, especially in the development of new antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
You want to get away from this.
There you go again, talking about the 1962
take off the handcuffs.
Act.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I've said it before. Why are we not developing diagnostics to figure out who's vulnerable to vaccine injury? I mean, it's happening enough that we should be able to do that. And imagine being able to say, oh, I'm not sure I should be taking this vaccine, or I'm not sure I should be taking X, Y, and Z. Is there some way that we can figure out if my kid is vulnerable or if I'm vulnerable? Imagine if we had that technology. And then maybe you would have a lot of people who are aren't, we could find out really aren't vulnerable to vaccine injury and could safely take it. Like, why can't
I'm glad you bring that up.
I don't understand that.
That's something that's interesting because, I have an immune disorder and I'm curious about how a vaccine would affect me. I've heard about people getting negative reactions, and it is something that I'm concerned about. So if there was a way to figure out my receptiveness to a vaccine, that would probably alleviate my fears, or at least prove me right. So,
and the big problem here is just that lack of conversation. Like, it is possible, Matt, that maybe there's something in the literature that would give us some scientific literature that would give us some indicator. I don't know. I haven't done the research. I mean, I would assume you haven't either, and that's okay. Like, we don't expect everybody to know everything instantaneously, but we need to be able to have those conversations rather than get smashed down every time somebody asks a question.
Well, it's the authoritative speaking and fear mongering that is not going to get us anywhere.
Yeah.
So we like to say a lot of companies try to use this language. We do it in our company, in fact, where we talk about, we have like an adult contract together, which is that we're able to talk to each other without kind of fear of reprisal.
Yes.
If we want to pose ideas and try to test things, and as long as we're doing it in a respectful manner, then this is easy. Do we have an adult contract together? Like, guys, come on. Like, this is a simple thing.
I thought we had a social contract.
Yes.
Signed somewhere.
Well,
Well,
we certainly aren't being treated like adults by the government. That's for certain.
That's
That's true.
and actually this is probably the best example of something that would be considered kind of a social contract. Is that do we have do we treat each other in our society with enough dignity that that this is expected of us, that these type of conversations can be had. The government does not want to behave this way anymore, and it will often say, well, it's because we have to talk down to people.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody's going. We need to talk to the, I don't know. It's like lowest common denominator type thinking or something. As if they literally believe that most people can't understand this stuff. They grossly underestimate people's ability to understand. It's like if they think that we're that stupid, then is it any wonder why they don't? Why? No, I'm not going to get into that. I shouldn't.
Right.
I shouldn't. Don't get me started.
Well, there you have it, folks.
This makes me very.
Norman Horn says the government thinks we're stupid.
Yeah, they do though. They often do. I mean, this is why.
Yeah.
Why else do you think that I mean, how did we get into this situation where Fauci at one point is saying, well, masks don't do anything. Well, then they do.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there is a plausible reason that they do. Like, that's fine. And that doesn't mean there should be a mandate, but the fact that we have keep getting this flip-floppy stuff around from the CDC and we don't get talked to like we're adults, then is it any wonder that people don't give them any measure of like goodwill and gesture?
Yeah.
Well, duh.
I mean, speaking as adults, I didn't invade Afghanistan and then botch it all up later. So, I mean,
yeah, there you go.
Well, and the reason why we want to be able to have these adult conversations is to persuade people to change their mind.
Yes.
You can't, when you start using all the fear tactics and the force, and we're going to make sure that you can't go to the grocery store if you don't do what we tell you to do, that triggers the defense mechanisms in our psyche. Like, all that does is shut down the persuasion, right? It also shuts down the innovation because, maybe, one person is absolutely convinced, no, the vaccine is good to go. And they're missing a piece of the picture, a piece of the puzzle. And somebody says, well, what about this? It's that, well, what about this that allows us to innovate, right?
Yep.
And that's what we need right now. We need to be able to be free to have that conversation, be free to disagree, not be, threatened to have our livelihood taken away from us and ostracized by society because we disagree. And
this is another reason, by the way, that lockdowns are terrible. Was when you put people away from each other intentionally like this and restrict their movements and like, how are you able to innovate? We can do a lot. Like our company, like my company, works very, very well virtually together, and that's great. We were prepared for this, if you will, of being more socially distanced than even before. But like, it still had an effect on us. But the more that we keep doing that, the less you can innovate. I mean, it's remarkable what we've been able to do in the scientific communities. We don't have time to get into that. But like this, it's crazy to think that like that we'll be able to lock down our way out of this. That is nuts. Yeah. So, it grinds my gears.
That can be the subtitle.
Well,
for this.
Yes. Well, we should probably start grinding our gears to, end this show here because we're this is probably the first show we've gone more than 30 minutes in a long time. So we're going to keep our listeners happy by not rambling too long.
Oh, I'm sure they like listening to me rant.
Oh, we all do.
Tune in next week for
Norman's
when Norman gets mad at something else,
like the government does. Or you could just go to libertarianchristtians.com.
Man yells at cloud.
You can go to libertarianchristtians.com, read everything Norman's written and all of his friends, and you can also listen to the Libertarian Christian podcast, which features Norman from time to time. Sometimes it's Norman and me talking. Sometimes it's Norman and Carrie talking. Sometimes it's just Norman talking.
Hey, that's happening soon.
And so thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you next time.
Catch you next time.